Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. I've been pretty busy recently creating a ton of awesome maps that I can't wait for you all to see. I had one of my biggest maps planned to release at this time, but unfortunately I have to push it back a little bit. Now in the past I've done quite a few post-apocalyptic cities, but none of those compare to the detail in this one. I wanted to create a similar style that I've done before, but with a twist of turning it into an overgrown city with vines and trees growing throughout the decaying buildings. Be sure to watch the whole video if you want to learn my process of level design and the overall making of this map. When you first start a map, you need to have an idea of the game mode that you want to include when you're done so you can build your layout around it. For any competitive maps, especially Gunfight which I was going for, both sides that players spawn need to be nearly identical in layout to prevent one team from having an advantage. The map layout is normally the hardest for people, but once you have a rough idea, it gets a lot easier from there. When I was thinking of layouts for this map, I wanted to include a swimming mechanic, but I didn't know how I can incorporate that into a city theme. One of my all-time favorite zombies game is The Last of Us, which I've used many times as inspiration in the past. One of the multiplayer maps in that game is a dam. I figured that would be the best way I could include water in the middle of a city and it making sense. From here, I can mess around with the placement of buildings and skyscrapers along with the bridge that will go over the center of the map. I won't show every building being made to save time, but you can get the premise of it after the first few. Make sure you create the buildings and spots that block the most lines of sight from the playable area of the map. If players cannot see it from the map, do not waste your memory or time making it. Once I had all the buildings created, I could start giving them the apocalyptic style. For all the buildings, I started ripping off the top few levels and replacing them with beams and ruined walls to show that the buildings were decaying. For two of the buildings, I created a massive hole that went straight through the building to allow the overgrown aspect to look super cool when I got to it. I did this on the other side as well, but at a later point that I'll get to soon. Once the buildings were finished, I could start adding in the vines and trees. I wasn't sure how it would turn out, but I absolutely loved the result. Now with level design on maps, especially competitive ones, you never want players to think they can go somewhere they really can't. The best way you can prevent this is adding visual cues to let players know they cannot access a certain area of the map. There are countless ways you can do this, but you need to find a way that fits your style. In previous maps of mine, you'll see me use police barricades for this, but unfortunately you cannot do that anymore, so you have to be more creative. To start, I marked the areas that I would be blocking off using large vehicles. I wanted to add a helicopter crash somewhere, so I thought it would be cool to have the crash scene incorporated into the barrier. I started destroying a path on the buildings to show that the helicopter scraped into it until eventually landing on the ground. I created a bunch of basic interior layouts that I could quickly copy and paste to fill up the empty space. Since players can't get into the building, it doesn't have to look pretty. I knew players would only be able to see the interior from one direction and a couple angles, so I just focused on those. Once I had that done, I started adding the ruined pieces again to give it the destructive look. Since walls are squared, the best way to make it realistic is curving pieces to stick in the corner to round it off. Again, it doesn't have to look perfect. As I said before, you can save memory and time by only focusing on angles that people can see it from. The farther away, the less you have to worry. Once I finished the background scenery, I could start focusing on the playable area of the map. Since I was already in the process of placing the tall grass, I just continued it. I made sure it wasn't too high because I didn't want it to obstruct players' view when they were running through it. Next I started on the player pathing to make sure everything runs smooth during gameplay. This is an extremely important part to level design because it helps with the replay value of your map. If players are getting stuck on stuff wherever they run or the map itself is a poor design, people will not return to it. I made sure there were plenty of routes people could take to ensure the whole map could be utilized and avoid players staying in one area to fight. After I got that done, I could continue with adding decorations and cover. I started with adding a bus on each spawn with the windows barricaded so the players can't get spawn sniped. I angled it so after players spawn, they had multiple ways to run without worrying about immediately getting shot. I was careful where I added certain objects and vehicles, and they almost all have a purpose. Finally, I needed to fill up the water so it wasn't completely open. I figured having some cool apocalyptic boats would fit perfectly. I was also able to use the larger one as another method of getting onto the bridge. After tweaking some lines of sight throughout the map, I was finally done. I spent quite a bit of time on this map, but it turned out amazing.